All right, so as you can tell by the title of this video, it's going to be focused on primarily getting stronger on hypertrophy lifts. To get right into it, there are two primary ways that you get stronger at a certain lift. It's going to be improved skill or increased muscle mass in the muscles used in that lift. Skill is going to be your overall form, technique, mind-muscle connection, and efficiency during that given lift. Basically, a much bigger indicator of increased muscle mass is going to be getting stronger on a hypertrophy or isolation movement rather than a compound movement. This isn't necessarily always the case, but I'll explain why this is actually a much better indicator of increased muscle mass than a standard compound barbell movement. Accessory or isolation movements, and I don't like the term accessory movement for hypertrophy training. I'll make a video basically debunking that term and basically moving on from that, like I think we all should when we're talking about this style of training. So bodybuilding, isolation, hypertrophy movements, whatever you want to call them, these are easier from a skill perspective. So if you gain strength in these lifts, it's a much better indicator of increased muscle mass. Let's take a bicep curl, for example. It does not take very long to learn a bicep curl. The only, I guess, difficult skill on that would just be mind-muscle connection, which is something you'll learn pretty quick with your biceps. So let's take a dumbbell bicep curl, for example. There's not a whole ton of room for growth in your technique and in your form, your overall skill on that lift. The reason is it's because it's an isolation. There's not a whole ton you can do wrong. You'll pick it up very quickly, and there's a very low ceiling for skill on that lift if you're doing it strict, as we all should. So when you can magically do more weight on that lift, it doesn't necessarily mean you got better at it. It's actually a very clear indicator that you built muscle in your bicep. With that being said, we've kind of talked about how the isolation and hypertrophy movements briefly are a pretty good indicator of increased muscle mass. So to talk a little bit more about these compound movements, the reason why I don't necessarily like judging your strength for muscle mass on compound movements is because they could be and are likely just a gain in skill, and it doesn't guarantee that you actually built muscle. There's a much higher ceiling for overall skill in these movements, and that's why when you see a beginner lifter doing squat, bench, and deadlift, and you compare it to a professional power lifter, or even just an intermediate or advanced regular gym goer power lifter, there is a massive difference in skill on these lifts. They're extremely difficult. They take a lot of muscles and a lot of joints, and basically are full body lifts, all three of them, squat, bench, and deadlift. So when your skill and your technique improves a tiny little bit, that generally results in a pretty quick increase in strength. And I see a lot of people talking about if you can just go from a 200 to a 225 bench, that guarantees that you have a bigger chest. I'm not going to necessarily disagree with that, but at the same time, making strength gains does not necessarily indicate that you built muscle, and it has much more room for error because of the skill development over time. And that's why isolation movements, where the skill isn't necessarily as much of a factor, that's why those are much better, in my opinion, for indicating increase in muscle mass. This applies to nearly all isolation movements and a lot of accessory compound movements, like take a lat pull down, for example, or any type of machine like a leg press or something. There really is not a whole ton of skill of that involved. You really just have to push or pull the weight as hard as you can with relatively decent technique. It doesn't take very long to get good at lat pull down. So when you get better, obviously there's a little bit of skill involved at first. Yeah, maybe the first 4 months, 6 months of your training obviously varies person to person. There will be a little bit of skill involved that you have to improve on. But in general, once your skill is at a certain point, it's just going to be proof of muscle mass being grown the stronger you get. My next point here is getting bigger does equal getting stronger, but not necessarily the other way around. If you increase muscle mass, you're guaranteed to be stronger. there's really no question about that. If, let's say, your arms grow by 1/2 inch, you are going to be stronger on bicep curls and tricep pushdowns. There's really no way around that. However, this does not apply to the other way around. If you get stronger, that doesn't necessarily mean you got bigger. Strength increase could just be a skill improvement, and that's why it's not actually the best way to indicate growth in muscle. So for some practical advice here, my solution to you guys is going to be tracking your strength on accessory movements. The reason why people don't do this actively is because it is difficult to get stronger on, and it takes time because they require an increase in muscle mass. I'll have a video on how to do this and why, basically where this went wrong in regular recreational lifting in the past, and why it's absolutely necessary if you want to build muscle optimally. So what I'd say is you guys got to start tracking your strength on accessory movements. I briefly discussed this in my last video where you basically change day to day. You make a couple steps up, maybe 1 or 2 back every now and then, but long-term progression on accessory movements is absolutely necessary. If you're not tracking them, please, I advise you, just start tracking. You don't have to change your program or anything, just write it down just so you know what's happening. That is a very good indicator that, let me step back for a second. If you are not getting stronger over time on accessory movements, you are probably missing a core fundamental to hypertrophy training, and that will be one of my next videos on my 4 fundamentals, as I stated earlier. So, to continue on this solution that I have here, what I would recommend is using the 10-ish rep range, depending on what you do for that movement. I generally do about 12 to 15 reps on a lat pull down. So that's an example. Let's take that lat pull down. I'd use about a 12 to 15 rep range because that's what I'm training for anyways. And because the form and technique used on an isolation for a 1 rep max is way different than a 10 rep max, contrary to compound movement. So obviously you guys kind of know what I'm talking about here. This is going to be maxing out. So your training is going to vary in the day-to-day and the week-to-week with a general trend forwards if you have the fundamentals of hypertrophy down. One thing that we do need to focus on is that isn't always the best way to do it. Sometimes it is good to do an actual max out set and take it to failure. So what I'd recommend, maybe quarterly do like a max out on that rep range that you're doing regularly for that exercise. So to step back here and go back to my lat pull down and a set of 12 to 15, maybe on January 1st, I would do a 15 rep max on my lat pull down. On, what would it be, April 1st, so about 3 months later, do another 15 rep max, or just take the weight that I used last time and see if I could beat 15. If I got stronger with good form, then clearly I built some muscle mass. So without going too much farther, without trying to make this too confusing, I will have videos in the future on how to apply this a little bit more practically, but track your accessories is what I'm trying to say. And yeah, it's not always going to be a big flashy PR because adding 5 pounds to a lighter lift is a much higher percentage than adding 5 pounds to a squat, bench, or deadlift. So it's not glamorous, it's not flashy, but we need to stop overlooking this. We need to stop being lazy with tracking our accessory. I hate that term, I don't know why I keep saying it, with tracking our hypertrophy-focused movements. With that being said, that's all I got for today, so thanks for watching.